This week on the Writers Detective Bureau, managing crime tips, counterterrorism, and the FBI National Academy. I'm Adam Richardson, and this is the Writers Detective Bureau. This is episode number 39 of the Writers Detective Bureau, the podcast dedicated to helping authors and screenwriters write professional quality, crime-related fiction. I'd like to thank Gold Shield patron Deborah Dunbar from DeborahDunbar.com and Gold Shield patron CC Jameson from CCJameson.com, and all of my Coffee Club patrons, including my latest patrons, Rick Seam and Dan Stout, for their support. These authors do the legwork in making their stories absolutely shine, so support them by checking out their books. Links to their websites are in the show notes at writersdetective.com/39. And if you have your own author business, consider joining Patreon. It's free for you, and it allows your readers to support you financially through monthly micropayments. Give your fans a chance to show their support by creating your own Patreon account right now. To learn more, visit writersdetective.com/Patreon, Patreon. This week's first question comes from Carol Ann Newsom, who you can find at canewsom.com. And Carol Ann asks, in my work in progress, my detective is flooded with nuisance tips. How are tips via Crime Stoppers and other avenues processed and handled? Well, you brought back some memories with this one, Carol Ann. The one-word answer I can give you is triage. Crime Stoppers, We Tip, and the others act as call centers for incoming calls. So the call takers are often volunteers or employees that usually have no knowledge of the crimes that are being reported to them. If we're doing a media plea, using the media to ask for leads, especially after releasing a photo or a surveillance video or a composite sketch, we may stand up our own anonymous tip line that is staffed with our own folks. Either way, we will take every single call and email, and collect it and review it. The ones we follow up on are prioritized based upon the likelihood that it matches with something that makes them seem relevant, and we'll also assess them on whether there's any reason to doubt the credibility of the caller. We have interesting people come out of the woodwork for these things. All of those call sheets or emails do get followed up on eventually, or at least we'll reach out to the caller if they left a way to contact them. But the more likely the tip seems to fit what we're working on, the higher the priority we place on that follow-up. I worked a fugitive case once that was featured on America's Most Wanted, the TV show, and they flew me from California to Washington, D.C. to be in the call center as the show aired across the different time zones of the country. By being in the room as the calls came in, I was able to quickly discern whether this was something we needed to follow up on immediately or not. And we filled an entire 4-ring binder with call sheets from AMW. The room itself was, it was rather small, but it had about 20 of the hardest working volunteers I've ever seen, talking to some of the craziest people out there. But they did so with the utmost professionalism and charisma. They were a great crew to work with. Going public with a tip line after a plea for help through the media definitely requires a plan. It requires resources to answer the calls, resources to filter the call info, those lead sheets, and then also resources that are in a position to immediately follow up on leads. You want to have detectives ready to go wherever those leads take them. The plan also requires a thought or a way to hold back something about the investigation, which I'm sure you're familiar with through fiction, and it's usually related to the MO of the crime, but something that's held back that's going to help weed out the leads that are BS. We obviously never divulge whatever those things are, but we will ask questions to see if the caller gives us any indication either way as far as whether there's a knowledge of that kind of stuff or not. And I should mention that this scenario that we're talking about usually is one where you have a high-profile case and you're expecting leads to come in. Crime Stoppers WeTip, and there are a dozen or so other call centers that take crime leads. They operate 24 hours a day for all sorts of crime reporting. So even in unreported crimes, we may get information from them. I would get anonymous drug dealing reports from Crime Stoppers all the time when I was working narcotics. It was usually reported by a neighbor that wanted to remain anonymous, or possibly a rival drug dealer trying to get rid of some competition, or even a customer that felt ripped off. But it often served as a starting point for building a case. Can I get a search warrant based off an anonymous Crime Stopper report of drug dealing? Probably not. Okay, it's a hard no. But it can be another drop in the probable cause bucket of those facts that we talk about that I might use in an affidavit later on, after I've done surveillance, trash runs, or even pretext stops of other drug users that are leaving that possible drug house that I'm watching. Sometimes that tip is all we need to be pointed in the right direction, and then we can handle the rest. Thank you for the question, Carol Ann. You can find her work at canewsome.com. William J. Manning, author of the Lilith Cohen series of spy thrillers, asked, "Is domestic terrorism and mass murder considered the same thing in America?" The short answer is no, not necessarily, and it has to do with intent. Now, the federal criminal definition of terrorism, and by that I mean the definition in Title 18 U.S. Code Section 2331, which is going to differ from how the CIA and the NSA and the military may define it. But the way it is defined in the federal criminal code is, and we're going to talk about domestic terrorism, acts dangerous to human life that are in violation of the criminal laws of the United States or of any state, and appear to be intended to either coerce or intimidate a civilian population, influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping, and will occur primarily within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. Now, that's domestic terrorism. Obviously, international terrorism would be outside of the United States, or by a group acting from outside of the United States, even if they're operating within the borders. So terrorism, beside all of that, terrorism really has to do with the intent of the killings. What was the intention behind them? Was it just a conspiracy to shut someone up? Was it retaliation for something? Or was it meant as a scare tactic, meant to scare or terrorize a population of people or the government of a people? When the intention of the major crime spree is to intimidate, to coerce, or to influence, that's when we're talking about terrorism. It's also important to understand that when someone is prosecuted for terrorism under this section, this means a criminal trial in federal court. This is the same process we've talked about before with a criminal complaint, a federal grand jury indictment, a discovery process for handing over evidence between attorneys, and then ultimately a trial. And it's all held in accordance with the Constitution, with the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure, the right against self-incrimination, the right to due process, a speedy trial, a right against cruel and unusual punishment. Domestic terrorists are typically American citizens committing crimes with that intimidation or coercion intention, like burning down a housing development for an eco-rights agenda. Those are the kind of things that are prosecuted this way. And you're probably thinking, but what about military tribunals and Guantanamo Bay? Well, this is where things start to get complicated. Those are the cases that are outside of U.S. federal criminal court. And we're normally talking about international terrorism cases, but not all of them. And they're handled under international humanitarian law, or more accurately put, the law of war, which is really a name for a body of international treaties, conventions, declarations, and judgments that go back over 150 years. So the rules of engagement vary greatly depending on the circumstances and who is involved. A large part of this has to do with the authorized use of military force that was passed by Congress in the aftermath of 9/11. And this authorized use of military force, or AUMF, against those responsible for the attacks on 9/11. And then they also included associated forces, which is the way that we're seeing modern people being detained and taken to Guantanamo Bay and stuff is under this associated forces. So even though they aren't necessarily those responsible for the attacks on 9/11, there may be some sort of connection that was proven by our intelligence agencies that show that there's a connection there. The 2012 National Defense Authorization Act for 2012, passed by Congress, affirmed the presidential authority for indefinite detention under the AUMF. So that's the reason why we still have people in Guantanamo Bay. So, to put it another way, if you're a terrorist associated with any group that was associated with the Taliban or the 9/11 conspirators, you may be treated as an enemy combatant, much like how Allied forces would have dealt with captured Nazis during World War II. The problem is that modern-day international terrorists are not quite the soldiers, spies, and saboteurs that the laws were really created for. What we are left with are international terror suspects that are in a bit of legal limbo. One of the biggest issues in treating these international terrorists as a criminal case is the issue of discovery. The argument being that handing over the list of evidence to the defense team, that classified information, would ultimately result in their clients learning all of those tactics, techniques, and procedures that were used against them, ultimately tipping the hand in the terrorists' favor in future operations. So the military tribunal or military commission is a process that I think was implemented more as a stopgap to afford these detainees some sort of due process to justify their detention. This is a major issue for human rights groups, and those groups argue that the criminal court system is the more appropriate venue for handling these suspected terrorists. And it's still actually the majority of the way that cases are being handled on an international level, especially when we're talking about lone wolves that have no ties to any of these forces that are these associated forces or the Taliban that are mentioned in the AUMF. So the other issue that the human rights groups argue is that the federal courts are actually properly situated for handling and protecting classified information. And the way that they do this is they're citing the fact that the military tribunals modeled their own classified discovery process after the federal courts model. So I think it was a smart decision to implement these military tribunals as some sort of way. You know, if you were completely innocent, you want to have some way to get out of this legal limbo and gitmo. But as we get further and further away from 9/11, I think we're going to see a change. This is one of those watch this space topics, I think, that will slowly evolve from what we currently have as a status quo, which is still a Bush era kind of implementation, to one of a more permanent legal practice. I think a lot of it will change eventually, especially when the balance of power in the U.S. swings back to the left. So in the meantime, if you're writing spy thrillers or any kind of counterterrorism thriller, the whole point of this is to start researching the law of war, authorized use of military force, enemy combatants, and military tribunals or military commissions. So there's a lot more out there than just the typical law enforcement federal criminal way of handling these kind of cases. So I really urge you to learn more about that. So thank you very much, William, for your question that you posed in the Facebook group. You can find William Manning's list of books, the Lilith Cohen series, on Amazon, and I will include a link to William's Amazon page in the show notes. And our last question also comes from the Facebook group from Jackie Gardner, who asked, Do PR people ever get involved to boost the police department's public image if the community and local media are unsatisfied with their efforts and expressing their dissatisfaction across social media? And she asked this in the context of a serial killer case that's unfolding in a story that she's working on. So I answered in the Facebook group, as for PR people, many or most agencies will have a PIO, or a public information officer. This may be a civilian or a sworn officer, often with a management rank like lieutenant or captain. There is specific training for PIOs on how to manage the media responsibly from a law enforcement perspective. The FBI National Academy teaches a media relations class on this. And in the media relations class, they talk about effective ways to partner with the media, especially as major cases are unfolding. You may hear the term feed the beast, and it means that you need to be, as a law enforcement agency, giving regular updates. And even if there isn't anything major to offer, you need to at least, on a regular basis, still meet with the media and, hold a press release that says, this is what we're doing, or provide some sort of other tangential information, but you don't want to go dark when it comes to your media message. So anyway, the reason I brought up this question is because of the FBI National Academy. This is really my last topic here for this week. The FBI National Academy, we've previously talked here about rank on this podcast, how titles like lieutenant and captain and commander are management level ranks. They're not necessarily, a detective lieutenant is middle management. They're not the one that is necessarily out there running down the leads and doing all of these interviews. What I haven't talked about is the training that these managers get once they are promoted. Just because you are a great street cop doesn't mean you will do a great job managing a team of human resource professionals or being a department spokesperson, that PIO we just talked about. I'm betting you've heard the term the Peter Principle. It's the tendency for people to promote to their level of incompetence. This happens in law enforcement, just like any other area where, that street cop turns into the ineffective middle manager. So to combat this, and then also to make policing more of a true profession, the FBI established the FBI National Academy in the 1930s. It was called something else back then, but nowadays the FBI National Academy is a 10-week program for law enforcement members in leadership positions from police agencies all around the world. The NA, as the members that go there call it, the FBI NA. So the NA is like going back to college and the police academy at the same time. And it's all for the sake of becoming better law enforcement leaders. Students will hear, now keep in mind, these are lieutenants and commanders and captains. Students will hear case studies on major investigations. They will learn about leadership, media relations, public speaking, case law updates. They will have physical fitness training, classes on constitutional law. I mean, it's just like college. You pick your own schedule. So if your story is set in Podunk Town in BFE, it is very possible that your chief or your sheriff might actually have some pretty dialed in FBI National Academy training under her or his belt. Now, I'm going to include a few links to more info about the FBI National Academy in this month's APB. Now, the APB is the Writer's Detective monthly email newsletter that is packed full of curated links for crime fiction writers just like you. Plenty of links for you to go down deep into the rabbit hole of research, whether it's about the FBI National Academy training or even something as random as learning the difference between what a coffin is and a casket. Did you know there's a difference between a coffin and a casket? It's little things like that I uncover throughout my regular workday working in law enforcement that I then pack in as these curated links. So it's not a whole bunch of affiliate links or anything to go buy or courses or any of that kind of stuff. It's just stuff that is really going to send you down that fun rabbit hole of research that immediately relates to the stories that you're working on. So the Writer's Detective APB is sent out on the last day of each month, and we are only a few days away from the April 2019 APB being sent out. So if you would like to join the APB mailing list, go to writersdetective.com/mailing list to sign up. And then immediately go to your inbox to confirm your enrollment. You don't want to have it fall into the spam folder, and you won't get it if you don't confirm. But when you do confirm, you're immediately going to get the January and February 2019 APBs. They will be in your inbox waiting for you, so you can see exactly the kind of links you're going to be getting each month. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Writers Detective Bureau podcast. Get your questions answered. Just visit writersdetective.com/podcast to send your questions to me for me to read on the air and answer for you. And don't forget to join the APB mailing list by going to writersdetective.com/mailing list. Thanks again for listening. Have a great week and write well.